Evelyn Marsh Ashcombe, Duchess of Farrow, stood at the centre of her own ballroom and did not move. She did not gasp. She did not reach for the nearest chair, though her hand found the back of one without her permission. She did not look at the woman in blue silk who had been arranged, with terrible care, in the place where a duchess ought to stand, 3 feet from the Duke of Farrow. Under the chandelier Evelyn had rehung herself 2 winters before, because the old chain was rusting through. She looked instead at her husband's mouth, which had just finished saying the words. Julian Ashcombe, 9th Duke of Farrow, had a voice that did not shake even when it should have, and it had not shaken now. He had said, to a room of 80 guests and 40 candles, and 1 long table of Aschencote's oldest families, that Mrs. Cassandra Vane would be the next Duchess of Farrow. He had said it plainly, the way a man reads out the terms of a sale. He had not looked at Evelyn while he said it. She reached up, unhurried, and drew the signet ring from her right hand, the seal ring, the one every Duchess of Farrow had worn since the first one, engraved with a wren inside a ring of wheat, the ring that made a document, and not merely paper. She set it down on the tray a footman was still holding, out of old habit, though no one had asked for wine in a full minute. She set it down with both hands, and with a gentleness that made the small sound it made, ring against silver, 1 soft note, the loudest thing in the room. By spring, half the county would call her something other than useful. But that was still 8 months away, and tonight there was only the ring and the tray, and 80 people deciding in real time what kind of woman did not weep when she was told, in front of them all, that she was being replaced. The summer of 1816 had come to Aschencote the way it always did, heavy with hay dust and indifferent to the households sweltering beneath it, and it was in that summer, 3 years before the ballroom, that Evelyn Marsh had married Julian Ashcombe in a chapel, with more moss on its roof than gilt on its rail. She had been 22. He had been the newly minted Duke of Farrow, 7 months into the title, with an estate that owed £100 to 3 separate creditors, and a father recently buried, who had spent the better part of 2 decades teaching his son one lesson above all others, that love was a debt a Farrow duke could not afford to carry, and that a wife, chosen correctly, was an asset like any other: land, timber, a good south field. Julian had chosen Evelyn for reasons he would have called sound. Her father, Thomas Marsh, had been the district's most exacting land agent, a man whose ledgers were spoken of in the county the way other counties spoke of good weather, and his daughter had learned every column of them at his elbow before she was 12. Julian needed an estate managed. He married the woman who could manage it, and told himself, in the particular arithmetic of a man protecting himself from disappointment, that this was a kindness to them both. It had not, in 3 years, been unkind. It had simply been quiet. Evelyn rose at 5:30, and was in the estate office by 6, going through rent rolls and drainage accounts, and the endless small arithmetic of 1,100 acres, and by the time Julian came down, later, always later, as though the day itself required his permission to begin, she had usually already solved whatever problem the day would otherwise have handed him. She did not tell him this. He did not ask. There is a particular loneliness in a marriage where both people are working very hard and never at the same task, and Evelyn had learnt to live inside it the way a person learns to live inside a house with an uneven floor, not comfortably, but without falling. She had given him a son. Edmund was 2 years old when the fever took half the tenant children on the low farms, and nearly took him too, and it was Evelyn, not the physician from Millbridge, who had sat up 11 nights running with cold cloths and her father's old remedies written in the margins of his ledgers, because her father had believed a land agent should know his tenants' bodies as well as their rents. Edmund lived. Julian had wept once in the hall outside the nursery, where he believed no one saw him, and had never mentioned it again. That was the shape of him, a man who felt things enormously and reported none of it, the way some houses have whole wings that are never opened, kept clean out of habit and never lived in. Her father had died the winter before the wedding, quietly, of a weak heart, leaving Evelyn a small annuity, a set of ledgers going back 30 years, and one sentence she had heard so often it had worn smooth as a river stone: "A ledger does not lie, even when the people who keep it do." She had put the sentence away somewhere she could find it, the way she put away most things that mattered, and she had gone on keeping her own books, publishing to no one. Correct to the penny, in the drawer she thought of, privately, and only to herself, as the place where the truth of the house was kept, whether anyone asked to see it or not. Cassandra Vane arrived in Ashencote in the April of the 3rd year, a widow of 30 with a dead husband's fortune, and a face the county agreed, within a week, was the finest they had seen since the old Duchess had been young. She took a handsome house on the Millbridge Road, entertained with a generosity that made the neighbouring families forget to ask where the money had truly come from, and was, within a month, seated beside Julian at every dinner in the district, with a frequency that had nothing to do with chance. She was warm where Evelyn was quiet. She laughed at things before other people finished saying them. She was. 3 separate matrons told Evelyn over 3 separate teacups, in the particular tone reserved for delivering a wound as a kindness, so very good for him. Evelyn heard it the way she heard everything that summer, without visible reaction, filed instantly into the drawer. The number of minutes she permitted herself to feel it counted out precisely, the way her father had once counted seed against acreage. 10 minutes for grief, no more. Then work. It was a discipline she had built for herself in the year her mother died and never dismantled, because it had never once failed her. What she did not yet know, in April, was that Cassandra Vane had brought to Ashencote more than a fine face and a widow's fortune. She had brought a solicitor named Silas Grieve, thin as a quill, who had spent 11 days in June going through the county records office under the excuse of a property dispute that did not exist. And she had brought, folded into the lining of a travelling case, a letter that was not what it claimed to be, a letter that would, by August, give the Duke of Farrow what he would tell himself, in the particular self-deception of a frightened man, was a lawful reason to do what his father had always warned him love would one day make necessary: to choose the estate over the wife, before the wife could one day choose to leave the estate over him. By the last week of July, Faramir owed £6,000 on a mortgage Julian's father had taken and never disclosed, called in without warning by a bank in the north that had itself changed hands twice in a year. Julian did not tell Evelyn the sum. He told Cassandra Vane over a private dinner at her house on the Millbridge Road on the 11th of August, and by the time he left that house near midnight he believed, because he had been shown a letter bearing what looked exactly like her father's own hand, and because he wanted, in some buried corner of himself, to believe it, that his marriage rested on a foundation that had never legally existed at all. The invitations for the harvest ball had already gone out. He did not cancel them. He decided, instead, to use the evening for something else entirely, and he told no one, least of all his wife, what that something else would be. The blow, when it came, came in full. The Farrow Harvest Ball had been held on the last Saturday of August for 11 generations, and this one began exactly as the others had, 80 guests. The long gallery hung with wheat sheaves and late roses, 4 fiddlers from Millbridge who played the same reel their fathers had played, and Evelyn moving through the receiving line in the green silk she had worn to 3 previous harvest balls. Because a new gown was an expense the tenant cottages needed more than she did. Edmund, 9 years old, and permitted to stay past his usual hour because it was harvest, sat on the stairs above the ballroom with his knees drawn up, watching the candles, the way he always watched things, quietly, missing nothing, exactly like his mother. It was Julian who called for silence, at 9:30, striking his glass with a spoon until the fiddlers stopped and 80 conversations died into one waiting room of a silence. "I find I have an announcement," he said, "that cannot wait for a quieter evening." Evelyn was near the punch table. She did not move toward him. Something in his voice, flat, rehearsed, the voice of a man reading a bill of sale rather than living through one, had already told her more than his words would. "There has come to my attention," Julian said, "a matter concerning the settlement made at the time of my marriage. I will not detail it here. I will say only that the settlement was not as it was represented to me, and that as a consequence my marriage does not stand on the ground I believed it stood on." He paused, started again. "I intend to see the matter set right, in law, as quickly as it can be done. And when it is done," here his eyes moved, for the first time to Cassandra Vane, standing 3 feet from him in blue silk, her chin lifted like a woman receiving a crown rather than witnessing a marriage dissolve, Mrs. Vane has done me the honour of agreeing to become the next Duchess of Farrow." For a moment the room made no sound at all. Then it made every sound at once, a chair scraping, a woman's indrawn breath, old Lord Hetheridge's cane striking the floor as he came half up out of his seat before his daughter pulled him back down. Evelyn set down her cup. She did not drop it. She set it down on the punch table with both hands, the way a person sets down something that has become, in an instant, far too heavy to hold with one. And the china made a small, terrible, gentle sound against the cloth. She crossed the floor. Every eye in the room followed her, and she let them, because there was nothing to be gained by hiding and everything to be lost by hurrying. She stopped in front of her husband. She did not raise her voice. "You will want the ring back, I expect," she said. "For her. Evelyn, I am not asking a question." She drew the signet from her hand. She set it on the tray a passing footman was carrying, more from habit than intention, and the ring made its one small sound against the silver, and it was, for 3 full seconds, the loudest thing in Ashencote. It was Edmund who broke the silence that followed. He had come down the stairs without anyone noticing, the way children do when the adults around them are too occupied with their own catastrophe to watch the smallest witness, and he walked the length of the ballroom in his good blue coat, past Lord Hetheridge, past 3 aunts with their hands pressed to their mouths, and stood beside his mother, and took her hand, the bare hand, the one that had just given up a ring, in both of his own. "That is my mother," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The room had gone so still that a child's plain voice carried to every corner of it. "She is the Duchess of Farrow. She has always been the Duchess of Farrow. I don't care what the letter says. Nobody in that ballroom, not the fiddlers, not the aunts, not Cassandra Vane in her borrowed blue. had expected the challenge to a duke's word to come from a 9-year-old boy in a good coat, holding his mother's hand as though he meant to hold it forever, if that was what it took. Julian did not answer his son. He stood very still, the way a man stands when he has built an argument that survives everything except the sight of his own child's face, and something behind his eyes, not softened, not yet, but moved. The particular movement of a man doing arithmetic he had not expected to have to do twice in one evening, flickered, and went still again. Evelyn knelt, there in the ballroom, in the green silk, and put her arms around her son in front of 80 witnesses who would talk of nothing else for a year. "Thank you," she said, quietly, only for him. "Now, we are going to go upstairs, and we are going to let your father finish his evening, and tomorrow we are going to begin." "Begin what?" Edmund asked. "Being right," she said, in a way no one can argue with. She rose, inclined her head to the room, not to Julian, not to Cassandra Vane, to the room, the way a woman takes her leave of a jury rather than a judge, and walked out with her son's hand in hers and her spine as straight as it had been the day she married. She did not look back. She permitted herself, once the ballroom doors had shut behind her and the cold of the hall met her face, exactly 10 minutes, standing very still in the dark corridor, one hand flat against the wall, counting her own breath, while Edmund watched her with an old man's patience in a boy's face. At the 10th minute, she straightened. "Right," she said, mostly to herself. "We have work to do." The old ledgers were still in the study where her father had left them, 30 years of Marsh accounts, bound in dun-coloured board and smelling faintly, always, of the beeswax he had used to seal them against damp. Evelyn went to them that same night, still in the green silk, a single candle burning low, and began at the year of her marriage settlement, because if Julian believed a letter existed proving the dowry had never truly been paid, then somewhere in her father's own hand there would be the proof that it had. Great-aunt Honoria found her there past 2 in the morning. Honoria was Julian's father's sister, 71 years old, unmarried by choice and famous in 3 counties for saying exactly what she thought exactly once, and never repeating herself. She had not attended the ball in years. Her hearing made crowded rooms an ordeal, but word of an evening like this one travelled faster than carriages, and she had come. "He is a fool," Honoria said from the doorway, without preamble. "He is frightened," Evelyn said, not looking up from the ledger. "Those are not different things in a man raised as he was raised." Honoria came in, sat, and folded her hands. "What do you need?" "Every paper my father ever touched concerning this estate, and someone who remembers 1813 as well as he did." "Old Simmons," Honoria said at once, "your father's clerk. He kept his own copies of everything, out of habit. God love him, he never trusted a single ledger that wasn't backed by another. He's in Milbridge still. Runs the accounts for the Corn Exchange." "Then tomorrow," Evelyn said, "I am going to Milbridge." "And what will you do?" Honoria asked, "when you have your proof?" Evelyn closed the ledger. For the first time that night, something in her face allowed itself to be seen. Not tears, never tears, but a stillness so total it was its own kind of answer. "I am going to make this estate impossible to run without me," she said. "And then I am going to make it impossible for anyone in this county to say my name and mean useful when they ought to mean Duchess. He can marry whom the law allows him to marry. But he will do it having watched exactly what he threw away, in daylight, for as long as it takes." Honoria studied her a long moment, the way a woman studies a horse she is deciding whether to bet on. "All right," she said. "All right," Evelyn agreed. And upstairs, in the dark, Edmund was already asleep with his shoes still on, having refused to take them off until his mother came to say good-night, as though the ordinary rules of an ordinary evening still applied. She went up. She took his shoes off herself, one and then the other, set them by the door, and stood a moment in the dark, listening to him breathe. Then she went back down to the ledgers, because the drawer where she kept her feelings was shut again, and there was work to do before morning. The drainage problem on the low farms had been eating 6% of the harvest every year for as long as anyone could remember, and every steward Faramir had employed in a decade had called it an act of God, and left it there. Evelyn had never believed in acts of God that could be measured with a level and a length of rope. 3 days after the ball, with half the county still talking of the boy on the stairs, she rode out to the low farms herself, in a plain wool habit, with old Simmons's borrowed theodolite strapped behind her saddle, and a tenant farmer named Tobias Wren walking the boundary beside her, because Tobias Wren had farmed that low ground for 22 years and knew, better than any surveyor Faramir had ever paid, exactly where the water wanted to go if no one stopped it. "Everyone says it's the clay," Tobias told her, as they walked the eastern ditch, water standing brown and ankle-deep even in a dry August. "Clay holds water," they say, "and there's nothing for it. Everyone is wrong," Evelyn said. She crouched at the ditch's lowest point, measured the full with the level, and frowned. "This ditch drops 4 inches over 200 yards. It should drop 4 inches over 50. Someone dug it wrong on purpose, or by ignorance 30 years ago, and every steward since has copied the mistake, because no one thought to question a ditch that was already there." "You mean to re-dig it?" "I mean to re-dig 1,100 yards of it before the autumn rains, at a cost I intend to keep under £40, using tenant labour paid a fair day's wage rather than a contractor from Millbridge charging 3 times the sum for half the care." She stood, brushing clay from her knees. "Will your neighbours work for me, Mr. Wren?" Knowing whose orders they'd be taking. Tobias Wren looked at her for a long moment, at the level in her hand, the mud on her boots, the calm, unhurried way she had just diagnosed in 10 minutes a problem that had cost the estate 6% of its harvest for 2 decades. "They'll work for whoever pays them fair, and knows what they're doing," he said. "Ma'am, begging your pardon, your grace. Most of them already say you're the one who's kept this place standing longer than anybody's said aloud." "Then let's say it aloud now," Evelyn said, with a level and a spade, "and let the ditch do the talking." The re-digging took 19 days and cost £38, 4 shillings. It was finished 11 days before the first true autumn rain, and when that rain came, the low farms held their water where it belonged, and lost none of it to the standing ditch that had drowned 4 acres of good barley the year before. Word of it moved through Ashencote the way water moves downhill, indifferent to intention, gathering as it went, and by the 2nd week of September the county was no longer discussing only the boy on the stairs. It was discussing the Duchess who had waded into a ditch in a plain wool habit and fixed, in 3 weeks, what 3 stewards had failed to fix in 20 years. Julian heard of it the way he heard most things about his own household lately, third hand, over dinner, from guests who assumed he already knew. He had not spoken to Evelyn beyond what the running of the house required since the night of the ball. He had moved his own rooms to the east wing, a change he told himself was a courtesy, and knew in the honest hours before dawn was closer to a retreat. He was aware, with the particular discomfort of a man watching a decision he had already made begin to look smaller with every week that passed, that the county's opinion of his wife was rising exactly as fast as his own certainty was falling. Cassandra Vane noticed it too. She said nothing of it to Julian directly, that was not her method, but she began, in small ways, to accelerate what she had planned to let unfold slowly. She wrote to Silas Grieve in September, asking whether the annulment proceedings could be brought forward. She held a dinner of her own, smaller and more pointed than the harvest ball, at which she made certain to mention, twice, how tiring it must be for a woman to manage an estate she would soon no longer have any claim to. Evelyn was not present at that dinner. She was, that same evening, in old Simmons's cramped office above the Corn Exchange in Millbridge, going through her father's private ledgers by lamplight, with a man who remembered every entry in them the way other men remembered Scripture. Here, Simmons said, tapping a page with one ink-stained finger, August of 1813. £450, paid in full dowry settlement, receipted by the old Duke's own hand, his father, mind, not your husband, the day before the wedding contract was signed. I copied this page myself, the week your father died, because I did not trust the original to survive a house that would soon have no Marsh living in it to guard it. And the letter Mrs. Vane's solicitor produced, Evelyn said. The one claiming my father admitted the sum was never truly paid, that it was a fiction agreed between the two families to save face. I have not seen it. But I would wager the whole of this office that whatever hand wrote it, it was not your father's. Because your father never once in 30 years wrote a 5 the way the rest of the county writes it. He closed the loop at the top. Always, a habit from his own father, and I have never in my life seen another man do it exactly so. Simmons sat back, forged his signature, and a careful man might manage it. Forged the particular tilt of every letter in a document nobody thought anyone would ever compare against 40 other pages in his own hand. That is a different labour altogether, and I do not think Mr. Silas Grieve is quite so thorough a forger as he believes himself to be. Evelyn sat very still for a moment. Will you swear to that, Mr. Simmons, before a magistrate if it comes to it? I swore an oath to your father before I ever swore one to a court, Simmons said. I'll swear to the truth. It has never once frightened me before. She rode back to Faramir that night, with the copied ledger page folded inside her cloak, close against her, the way a person carries something they intend never to let out of arm's reach again. The road was dark, and the moon was thin, and for the length of that ride she allowed herself to think, plainly, without ceremony, he believed a stranger's forged letter over 30 years of my father's true hand, because it was easier than believing a wife might be worth what a debt was worth. It was not a thought that made her weep. It made her sit straighter in the saddle. The document that would rewrite everything did not arrive all at once. It arrived, as such things do, in pieces, each one requiring its own patience. The first piece was old Simmons's sworn copy, delivered to Evelyn in October with his own seal upon it. The second was a letter from her father's former banker in Millbridge, a Mr. Aldous Penrose, who had since become the county's most respected solicitor, confirming that he himself had witnessed the original dowry payment cross his own counting table in 1813, and that he retained, in his own strong-box, the receipt bearing both the old Duke's signature and his own. The third piece, and the one that took longest to secure, came from inside Cassandra Vane's own household. Her lady's maid, a girl of 19 named Sarah Bligh, had been in service to Cassandra for 2 years, and had in that time carried a great many letters to a great many places without ever being told what they contained. She had carried one, in July, to a printer's shop in the next county that specialised, though it did not advertise the fact, in matching ink and hand for a fee. She had thought nothing of it at the time. She thought a great deal of it in October, when she overheard her mistress laughing, with Silas Grieve, over a 9-year-old boy's misplaced loyalty, and something in Sarah Bligh, who had a mother of her own and no love at all for cruelty dressed as wit, curdled into resolve. She came to Faramir on a Tuesday, in her afternoon off, and asked to see the Duchess. "I don't know what's in the letters," Sarah told her, twisting her gloves in her lap in the small parlour Evelyn kept for exactly this kind of unannounced honesty. "I never read them. But I carried one to Mr. Corliss's shop in July, the printer near Denholt, and I know what Mr. Corliss does there, because the whole street knows and nobody says it plain. And I heard Mrs. Vane laugh at your boy, ma'am. My own mother raised 5 of us alone after my father died, and not one of us was ever spoken of like that in a house that thought itself grand for it. Would you say this before a magistrate?" Evelyn asked her gently. "It would cost you your position, likely your character, if Mrs. Vane chooses to fight it." Sarah Bligh's hands stopped twisting. "I've a place waiting with my aunt in Denholt if it comes to that," she said. "I'd rather have an honest position with nothing in it than a grand one with that in it." It was the 4th piece, and the one Evelyn had not gone looking for, but received anyway, in the particular way the truth accumulates once it has been given room to move, that arrived without warning on the last day of October, when Silas Grieve himself, having heard that old Simmons and Aldous Penrose had both been seen entering Faramir with sealed papers under their arms, panicked in the manner of a man who has built his whole scheme on no one ever checking his work, and rode to Faramir uninvited to attempt, quietly, to buy Simmons's silence. Simmons was not a man whose silence had ever been for sale, at any price, and he told Evelyn everything within the hour, in writing, with his own signature at the foot of the page. Cassandra Vane, informed by Grieve of his failure, did not panic. She did what a patient, deniable woman does when a plan begins to bend. She moved to close it quickly, before it could break. She sent word to Julian that the annulment papers were ready for his signature, and suggested, with the particular warmth she used when she wanted a thing done before it could be examined, that the matter be finalised before the county's harvest tribunal met in November, a public sitting, held every year at the Millbridge Assembly Rooms, where the district's land disputes, boundary questions, and any matter touching the county's great families was heard, by tradition, before the whole neighbourhood. It was, Evelyn realised when she heard of the date, precisely the wrong choice for Cassandra Vane to have made, and precisely the right one for her. She wants it done quietly, in a solicitor's office, with only Julian and Grieve and herself in the room, Evelyn told Honoria. The 2 of them at the long table in the estate office, papers spread before them like a hand of cards finally worth playing. She has pushed for the tribunal, because Julian, in his present state, would rather have the county see it settled and behind him than see it argued at all. She thinks a public hearing works in her favour, because Julian's shame will make him agree to anything that ends it fastest. "And you mean to let her have her public hearing?" Honoria said. "I mean to be exceedingly grateful for it," Evelyn said. "She has just done my work for me. I would have had to invent a reason to bring this before the whole county. She has provided one, and put a date on it. The Millbridge Assembly Rooms had never, in living memory, held a crowd like the one that gathered on the 2nd Tuesday of November. Word of the harvest ball had travelled all autumn, gathering detail as it went, and word that the matter would be heard at the tribunal before Magistrate Holbrook, in open session, as any land or contract dispute in the county was heard, had emptied half the drawing-rooms of Ashencote into the assembly hall by 9 in the morning. Tobias Wren was there, and a dozen tenants from the low farms behind him, still in their working coats, because they had come straight from the fields, and would not be told a duchess's hearing was too fine an occasion for honest clothes. Old Simmons sat near the front, with a leather case on his knees. Aldous Penrose sat beside him. Sarah Bligh, dismissed from Cassandra Vane's household the week before, on a manufactured complaint about a missing brooch, sat 2 rows back, with her hands folded, and her chin level. Julian sat at the front beside Cassandra Vane, and did not look at his wife when she entered, though every other person in the room did. Magistrate Holbrook called the matter irregularities alleged in the Farrow marriage settlement of 1813, and invited Mr. Silas Grieve to present the document upon which his client's claim rested. Grieve did so. His hands, Evelyn noted, were not entirely steady, though his voice was practised. He read the letter aloud, a confession, purportedly in the hand of the late Thomas Marsh, admitting the dowry sum had never been paid, that the figure recorded in the settlement was a fiction agreed to spare both families embarrassment. "Thank you, Mr. Grieve," Magistrate Holbrook said, when he had finished. "Your Grace, this to Evelyn, who rose, you may respond." She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to. "I would ask the court's indulgence to call 2 witnesses and enter 3 documents," she said. "I believe, once heard, they will settle the matter more thoroughly than argument could." She called Aldous Penrose first, who testified, plainly and at length, that he had personally witnessed the dowry payment of £450 cross his own counting table in August of 1813, that he had retained the original receipt in his strong-box for 11 years precisely because it was his habit to retain every document he ever witnessed, and that the receipt bore both the elder Duke of Farrow's signature and his own. He produced it. It was passed, at Holbrook's direction, along the bench for inspection. She called old Simmons next, who laid Thomas Marsh's original ledger page beside Grieve's letter on the magistrate's table, and asked, quietly, whether the court might compare the formation of a single figure, the number 5, across both documents, and across 40 other pages of Marsh's undisputed hand that Simmons had brought, bound, in his leather case. The room, as Holbrook and 2 clerks bent over the pages, went very still, the particular stillness of a crowd realizing, all at once, that it is about to watch something break. "The 5 in the ledger closes its loop," Holbrook said at last, to the room as much as to the bench, in every one of 40 pages. "The 5 in this letter does not close it, in any of its 4 instances. I am no forger's expert, Mr. Grieve, but I have eyes, and so does every person in this hall." Silas Grieve did not answer. He had gone the colour of old paper. It was Sarah Bligh's testimony, given last, that finished what the ledgers had begun, her plain account of the errand to Mr. Corliss's shop, delivered without embellishment, in the flat voice of a girl who had decided that telling the truth once, completely, mattered more than keeping the position it cost her. When she named the date and the shop and the parcel's weight, 3 separate people in the gallery, men who knew Corliss's trade, though none of them had ever said so aloud in a drawing-room, nodded, unbidden, exactly the way a jury nods. Cassandra Vane's composure did not crack. It simply, visibly, went out, the particular extinguishing of a woman who has built an entire performance on never once being asked a question she could not answer smoothly, meeting, at last, a question she could not answer at all. Mrs. Vane Holbrook said, "Have you anything to say?" She said nothing. That, in its way, was the whole of her answer. Evelyn rose once more before the tribunal closed, and the hall, sensing the shape of what was coming, quieted itself without being asked. "I would say only this," she said. "Mr. Grieve broke the law for money, and the county's courts will settle what is owed for that, and I will not stand in the way of whatever they decide. Mrs. Vane came to Ashencote, a widow, with a fortune of her own, needing neither this house nor this title, and chose instead to take them by forgery rather than earn them by any honest means available to her. I could ask this court for a great deal. I ask instead only that the settlement stand as it always legally stood, and that Mrs. Vane and Mr. Grieve be permitted to leave this county without further public accounting, provided they trouble it no further." She paused. "I have found that mercy, offered from a position where I did not have to offer it, tends to be believed more readily than mercy offered from a position of no other choice. I would rather be believed." It was, the Assembly Hall agreed in the weeks that followed, the single most talked of sentence spoken in Millbridge in a generation. The hall did not empty quickly. It rarely does after a thing like that. Julian sat through the whole of it, through Penrose's receipt, through Simmons's 40 pages, through Sarah Bligh's flat, unwavering account, without once looking away, and when Magistrate Holbrook finally closed the session, declaring the Farrow settlement of 1813 sound, in every particular, and Silas Grieve's letter, a forgery to be referred to the assizes, Julian did not rise with the rest of the room. He sat a moment longer, alone amid the general noise of 80 conversations restarting at once, and then he stood, and crossed the hall, and stood in front of his wife the way she had once stood in front of him. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "not an apology first. I know you would tell me those are different countries, and you would be right, and I mean to give you both, in the right order if you will let me." "I am listening," Evelyn said. He told her, there in the thinning crowd, with Edmund's hand finding hers again from somewhere in the press of people, what he had never told her in 3 years of marriage, that his mother had left when he was 7, not died, as the county politely believed, but left, walked out of Farrowmere on a spring morning with a portmanteau, and no explanation, because his father had spent a decade treating her as a transaction rather than a wife, and she had finally, quietly, refused to be one any longer, that his father had raised him afterward on a single doctrine, repeated so often it had become bone rather than belief, that love was the one ledger entry a Farrow Duke could never balance, and the only safe course was never to enter it at all. That when the mortgage came due, and Cassandra Vane arrived with money and a letter that told him exactly what his fear already wanted to hear, that his wife's claim on him was not, after all, as solid as he had feared it might be. He had believed it not because the forgery was skilful, but because some frightened boy inside him had been waiting 19 years for permission to believe that love always, eventually, walked out with a portmanteau. "That is the explanation," he said. "It does not excuse what I said to you, in front of the whole of Ashencote, in front of our son. I know the difference. I am not asking you to forgive the sentence because you now understand where it came from. I am telling you where it came from, because you deserve to know the whole of the mechanism, not only the wound it left." Evelyn was quiet a long moment. "Thank you," she said finally. "That is the explanation. I have not yet heard the apology." He gave it to her plainly, without ornament, the words costing him visibly, the way honest words always cost a man who has spent his life avoiding them. "I am sorry," he said. "Not sorry it was discovered. Sorry I said it at all, in any room, to any person, believing for 1 hour that you were something I might trade rather than someone I had married. You were never merely useful to this house, Evelyn. You were the reason this house still stands, and I called you an asset when I ought to have called you beloved. And I am 3 years too slow in saying so. All right, Evelyn said. All right, Julian repeated, as though the phrase might mean less than it sounded. All right then, she said. That is not forgiveness yet. It is an agreement to begin discussing terms. A ghost of something crossed her mouth, not quite a smile, the particular almost smile she had not permitted herself in front of him in 3 years. I find I have several. They discussed them 2 days later, in the estate office, at the long table where she had spent 3 years balancing his accounts without his notice. She named them plainly, one by one, the way a solicitor reads a contract's clauses, that the ring, and the authority that came with it, was never to be treated as a thing that could be lifted from her hand by announcement again, in public or in private, that the estate's books, which she had kept for 3 years unacknowledged, would be kept openly from now, with her name entered beside his on every ledger, and her signature required, not merely permitted, on any matter touching the tenants or the land. That the tenants who had redug the low ditch would be paid, going forward, a fair day's wage set by written schedule rather than a steward's discretion, and that this would be posted, publicly, at the estate office door, where any man could read what he was owed, that Edmund would grow up knowing precisely why he had stood on that ballroom floor, and that his father would tell him so, in his own words, before the boy was much older, and that whatever came next between them, and she would not yet say what that might be, would be built the same way the ditch had been rebuilt, slowly, correctly, and in full view of anyone who cared to check the work. All right, Julian said, when she had finished. All right then, she said, and that, for the moment, was the whole of the treaty. The months that followed were not dramatic, and Evelyn had not expected them to be. Proof, when it finally came, arrived the way most true things arrive, in small units, repeated until they could no longer be doubted. It arrived in the chair Julian began, in December, to draw up beside hers in the estate office of an evening, not to direct her work, but to share it, asking questions now instead of assuming answers, learning the columns his own father had never taught him, because his own father had believed a duke need not trouble himself, with sums a wife could be made to carry alone. It arrived in the tea he began, without being asked, to pour for her before he poured his own, a small thing. The narration of her own private accounting noted, meaning nothing at all by itself and everything by its accumulation. The way a single brick means nothing, and a wall means a house. It arrived on a cold morning in February, when a letter came from the north. The same bank that had called in the old mortgage, offering, now that the estate's finances had been shown before a magistrate to be sound, and its management shown before a county to be exceptional, a far more forgiving arrangement than the one that had nearly broken them the previous August. Julian read it twice, then carried it not to his study, but to hers, and set it on the table between them, and said, "This is your work as much as mine. I would like your signature on the reply, if you are willing to give it." There was one relapse, in the spring, small and honest in the way relapses are honest. A boundary dispute arose with a neighbouring farm, and Julian, out of 19 years of old habit rather than any renewed unkindness, rode out and settled it alone. The way his father had taught him a duke settles things, without consultation, without record, decision handed down rather than built together. He told Evelyn of it that evening, pleased with himself, and watched her face go carefully, quietly still. "You did that alone," she said, "not an accusation, a naming." He stopped, started again. "I did," he said. "I did not think to ask you before I rode out. I am sorry. It was old habit, not old intention, but I understand that from where you stand, those may look identical for a while yet." "They do," she said. "Do better next time." "I will," he said, and the following month, when a tenant's lease came up for renewal, he brought the papers to her table before he signed a single line, and said nothing at all about it being any kind of test passed, because by then it no longer needed saying. It was Edmund, in June, who asked the question neither of his parents had yet asked aloud. He was 10 now, taller by an inch, and had taken to following his mother into the estate office most afternoons, learning the columns the way she had once learned them at her own father's elbow. "Are you and father going to say it?" he asked, without looking up from the ledger he was copying. "Or are you just going to keep pouring each other tea until I'm grown?" Evelyn laughed, the real laugh, rare enough by then, that Julian, coming in at that exact moment, stopped in the doorway simply to hear it. That evening, on the terrace, with the low farms turning gold in the last of the light, and the ditch she had redug carrying off a summer storm's worth of water, without a single flooded acre to show for it, Julian took her hand, not the hand that wore the ring, the other one, and said, "I would choose you. Not because a magistrate ruled I must, and not because the mortgage is settled, and not because Edmund would never forgive me otherwise, though he would not. I would choose you if none of that were true. I have, in fact, been choosing you for some months now, in small ways, hoping you would notice before I found the courage to say it outright." "I noticed," Evelyn said. "I keep a ledger of everything, remember. And what does it show? That the entries are consistent," she said, "and consistency, in my experience, is the only kind of proof that has ever meant anything at all." She turned her hand over in his. "All right." "All right, then," he said, and this time it was not merely a treaty. It was, at last, the whole of an answer. 2 years passed the way years pass on a working estate, measured in harvests rather than seasons, the low farms yielding, by the second autumn, 11% above the district average, a figure old Simmons liked to quote to anyone who would listen, with the particular pride of a man watching a pupil outgrow the teacher. The mortgage was cleared in full 18 months ahead of its revised schedule. Silas Greaves stood trial at the county assizes, and was struck from the solicitor's rolls, his practice ruined by his own forged hand, which the court found, on close examination, incapable of closing a single loop the way an honest man's did. Cassandra Vane left Ashencote before the winter was out, and was not spoken of again in any drawing-room that mattered, though it was said, years later, that she had married a merchant in the north, who valued her charm, and never once asked her to forge anything on his behalf, which some who knew her considered the nearest thing to a happy ending she was likely to earn. Sarah Bligh, who had lost a position and gained nothing but the truth for it, was engaged the following spring as governess to Faramir's own nursery, at a wage Evelyn set herself, posted alongside every other wage on the estate office door, where any man or woman who worked the land could read exactly what honesty was worth in that house. Tobias Wren's eldest boy was apprenticed, at Evelyn's arrangement and expense, to a surveyor in Denholt, the first of the low farm families ever to send a son into a trade above the plough, and it became, within a few years, a kind of local tradition, a Faramir scholarship, the tenants called it, though Evelyn never called it anything so grand herself. Edmund, at 12, wore his father's old signet for practice at his lessons, learning to seal a letter properly, and Evelyn watched him do it one autumn evening, with something that was not quite pride, and not quite relief, but sat very near to both. The ring itself, Evelyn's own ring, the wren inside the ring of wheat, never left her hand again after the tribunal, except once, on the 2nd anniversary of the harvest ball that had nearly ended everything, when Julian asked her, quietly, in the estate office where they now worked every evening side by side, whether he might borrow it a moment. He took it to the jeweller in Denholt himself, without telling her why, and returned it a week later with a second wren, smaller, engraved inside the first, a mark that had never appeared on any Farrow Duchess's ring before hers. It means, he told her when she asked, that the seal that makes this house's word true is not only inherited, it is chosen. I wanted it recorded in the one kind of paper that has never once lied to either of us. Farrowmere, that autumn, no longer held its breath the way it had for 3 long years before the ball. The hallways that had once felt like rooms waiting for an argument to finish now simply felt like rooms full of ordinary noise, a boy's footsteps on the stairs, 2 people's voices overlapping companionably over an evening's accounts. The particular quiet of a house that has at last exhaled, she had never asked to be seen. She had made herself instead impossible to unsee, not through a raised voice, not through a single dramatic gesture, but through 1,100 yards of a well-dug ditch, 40 pages of an honest man's hand, and a boy who had stood up on a staircase and refused, on his mother's behalf, to accept a lesser truth than the one he already knew. Love, in the end, had not rescued her. It had simply arrived, late and chastened, to stand beside the life she had already built without it, and ask, humbly, to be let in on her terms rather than his. She had granted the terms not because he had earned forgiveness by suffering enough, but because he had proven, in the smallest and most ordinary hours, that he understood the difference between being sorry and being changed. That was not a thing that could be undone by a forged letter, or a frightened man's old doctrine, or any ledger anyone would ever think to falsify again. It had been earned the only way anything of real value was ever earned in that house, slowly, honestly, in full view of anyone who cared to check the work.